Hello, I'm very excited to be with you all today for this webinar on attending to trauma during child welfare removals. I'm excited to be talking to you about this topic because it requires so much more attention than it's actually been given historically. In child welfare and in our practice model, we focus on very specific goals, which include safety, well-being of children, well-being of families, permanency, but the well-being of children and families carry a lot more nuances than one can actually imagine, especially if we look at the generic definition of well-being as being a state of being comfortable, healthy, or happy. I want to start by introducing myself first. My name is Dr. Jean-Jacques. I work with Citrus Health Network. Citrus Health Network is a federally qualified health center in Miami. We pride ourselves with our mission of helping people through holistic approaches and innovations to the system of care. I am currently the director of prevention services at Citrus Family Care Network, which is the child welfare division of Citrus Health Network. We're the lead agency for Miami-Dade and Monroe counties. A little bit about myself, my background. I'm a licensed clinical psychologist, and I have worked in child welfare for the last 14 years now. I started as a therapist providing interventions to children in statewide inpatient psychiatric programs. And after that, I continued to work with children in specialized therapeutic foster homes, group homes, and I remained in foster care for years before I actually started working in prevention. It is during my time providing prevention services that I was actually very fortunate to be part of some of the specific processes in child welfare. I still vividly remember, for instance, going out on joint visits, joint responses with the investigators, with DCF, and witnessing removals. I watched children clinging to their mother's legs while later they would be brought into a car with a stranger. Children crying and really not understanding much about what was happening, except that something terrible was happening. As a therapist, I was trained to intervene, to de-escalate, to assist in difficult times, while a lot was happening at the same time and very, very fast. I remember to this day, on the last removal about 9 years ago now, I want to say, feeling at a loss, trying to navigate the intensity of all the dynamics happening during the removal. And I was a trained therapist. I could not even fathom the demands placed on the investigator during that time. So today we're going to talk a lot about the removal itself, the traumatic experience that it is, and the fact that it really deserves more tailored interventions and action in our system of care. So we'll talk about trauma itself, the impact of the trauma removal on various levels. We'll discuss specific innovations in Miami that serve to mitigate the trauma for the child, and key strategies that can hopefully help you apply trauma-informed practices in your work. Before we dive into things, I'd like to take a small poll and get a better sense of where everyone is from. If you can please take a couple of minutes to tell me where you're from, if you're from Florida. If you work in child welfare, and if you work in the front line directly with children and families. So we're going to be using the term trauma quite a bit during this webinar. So how about we get started on defining what it is? What is trauma? As defined by the American Psychological Association, trauma is an emotional response to a terrible event like an accident, a rape, or a natural disaster. Trauma can be caused by natural events, or it can be human caused. It can be unintentional, such as the collapse of a building, or it can be intentional, such as a rape. So when looking at trauma, we want to consider both objective and subjective characteristics of trauma. There is trauma that occurs at a single point in time, and there is trauma that's repeated. It could be a series of traumas happening to the same person over time, such as physical assaults. And we tend to see in repeated or chronic trauma, like emotional abuse also, those tend to wear down resilience in an individual and the individual's ability to adapt in general. Other characteristics to consider, you want to know if there was enough time or opportunity for the person to process the traumatic experience. You can easily have what's called cascading trauma, where an individual may not have had the time to heal from the traumatic event before another one actually happens. You also want to consider how many losses result from the trauma. And one of the biggest variables in trauma, and the trauma response itself actually relates to the number of losses. The greater the number of losses, the more challenging it actually is for the child or for the person to recover. Was the trauma expected or unexpected? Was it intentional? Intentionality actually plays a very big role here, especially when in the trauma response, people tend to struggle with ideas of the causality, what motivated the act. They struggle to understand why it happened and even the psychological makeup of the perpetrator. What was the victim's physical or emotional proximity to the trauma? Was it experienced directly or indirectly? We also want to know what happened since the trauma. To what degree did normal activities resume or were disrupted? And last but not least, what is the cultural meaning of the trauma? Some cultures may attach specific meaning to certain events, and they may have different interpretations of the act itself. Some native tribes, for instance, may view a traumatic experience as retribution, making the sudden death of a loved one, for instance, less traumatic because there's a belief, for instance, in the afterlife. So we want to look at all those different factors when looking at trauma. There are also different ways that trauma can have an impact. You can have trauma impacting an individual. So trauma on an individual level affecting one person directly or indirectly, such as stabbings or beatings. We tend to see physical injuries actually more prevalent in individual type of traumas. In those cases, the interesting thing that happens with individual trauma is that people are less likely to actually reveal their trauma or receive validation for their experience, and they're more likely to struggle with those issues of causation. They feel isolated and experience repeated trauma as well as a result because they're not reaching out, and therefore the availability of the support system is minimized. We also can have group trauma where the events affect a particular group, your first responders, investigators, case managers, groups that particularly place themselves in harm's way. And these groups are likely to experience repeated trauma in general because of the nature of the field that they're in and their roles. And in those cases, what's interesting is that we tend to see folks keep the trauma experience within the group. They tend to feel that others outside of the groups are intruders, and talking about the trauma outside the group is almost a violation of the group confidentiality and brings shame to the group. So some group members will be very specific, overtly or covertly, even discourage others from seeking help or talking about it. Those groups we know experience specific stressors. They get exposed to very bad scenes. They face violence from parents or other parties that they may be interacting with. They also may be experiencing and observing directly human suffering. And all of that, to keep in mind, is in addition to the work conditions, working beyond physical exhaustion, and typically having the pressures of working against the clock. Finally, we have what's called community or mass trauma, which covers a broad range of violence and atrocities in general, that can take away the sense of safety that is within a community. Gang violence, school shootings are some examples of those group traumas. And these types of trauma can create an immediate sense of community as well among folks, however. The feeling that, you know, you're in the same boat with someone. The isolation that we see in individual trauma is actually removed, and blame here is often externalized, making it easier to ask for help. We recently witnessed the devastation in some areas in the Southwest region for our state of Florida with Hurricane Ian, that left many areas in shambles. And we witnessed at the same time a lot of people rallying and having that community spirit in the face of tragedy. And to bring our particular topic into focus, we have what's called developmental trauma, where highly stressful events, traumatic experience occur during a given developmental stage. And those events can influence later development, adjustment, as highlighted specifically by the ACE Childhood Experiences study that examined the long-term effects of common childhood adversities on individuals. What those studies have shown is that people with high or multiple ACE exposures are at increased risk of chronic illnesses, including physical, mental, and substance abuse problems. What's interesting with this study is that they've actually added a specific common childhood adversity to the original 10 common childhood adversities in the initial ACE study. And this particular adversity is separation from a parent or caregiver, either because of foster care involvement or immigration. So all in all, what I'm saying here and what I'm trying to highlight is that separation from a parent negatively impacts a person's well-being well into adulthood. So I want to pause here and have us sort of think about this statement itself and how it's recognized as having a long-term effect, the separation from a parent. So a removal, the separation of a child from their parent, is an adverse childhood experience. I feel, again, that thinking about the removal in those terms provides a different perspective altogether. If anything, it ought to encourage us, right, to take a step back and examine the decision at hand, the decision of a removal itself. We all know what a removal is in essence, but the question is, do we really understand what it means, what it represents and means for an investigator, what it represents and means to a parent, and what it represents and means to a child. So we're going to play a short clip to get us started on this particularly sensitive topic.
A year and a half ago, 47-year-old Monica, mother of 3, was in love with a man she hoped would be a good husband and a good father. He turned out to be abusive.
Had he ever hurt your kids before?
No.
Had he ever hurt you?
Yes.
Monica ended the relationship and took out a restraining order, hoping the worst was over. But Monica's nightmare was just beginning.
He felt the only way that he could get me to communicate with him was to go to the school and take my child. That's how he lured me to the park.
Monica panicked. Her 6-year-old daughter was in the hands of someone she knew to be dangerous.
I called the police. They didn't show.
Frustrated and afraid for her child, Monica then did something she now deeply regrets.
I took a gun and I went to the park. I was afraid of him. I just thought, I can't allow him to kidnap or hurt her or me. He didn't take me serious. I wind up firing a shot in the air. I was arrested and my children were taken into custody that day.
No one was physically hurt, but the consequences were devastating. Monica was sent to jail, charged with assault with a deadly weapon and child endangerment. With no family members to take them in, her 3 children, Troy, Kaliha, and Mwani, were placed in foster care.
It's a very scary feeling. You feel empty, you're worried, are they okay? Are they all right? How are they feeling? Is the foster home they're in, are they treating them well?
Part of Monica's concerns for her kids stemmed from personal experience.
How long were you in foster care?
From the ages of 10 to 16. I remember the first night of being taken, I was very scared. Even though I was being abused, I was being taken from my home. I felt very alone and like I was being punished for something that I had no control over.
Monica says she spent years in the system, in and out of over 30 placements.
And that's why I was so determined to let them know that I would never stop doing what I had to do until I get them back. And I won't. I won't stop until I get them back.
So I invite you all to reflect on a few things here. Have you ever been involved in a removal? Have you had to ever explain to a child why they were being removed? What impact do you think the removal has on a family unit? As we focus on keeping children safe, we need to develop more awareness of the impact the removal has on the family. We need to pay attention to the impact of those processes on the family and ultimately be able to respond in a manner that truly promotes the well-being of the child and the parent. In the Southern region last year, 678 children were removed from their home. This number actually represents one of the lowest rates of removals in the state of Florida out of the 14,000 plus abuse calls accepted by the hotline last year for our region. We put a very heavy focus on prevention services here in Miami and Monroe counties to prevent those removals from happening. We have teams going into the homes, providing services in a natural environment, working with families to stabilize the unit as much as possible. But sometimes those efforts are not always successful. They don't always work. And removals do happen as a result. When safety concerns, whether they're present danger safety concerns or impending danger threats, when they cannot be mitigated, then and there's no ability to implement a safety plan in the home, children are removed. And most typically, the most current maltreatment trends that we see tend to be around household violence, inadequate supervision, and substance misuse. Those are the most common trends that we tend to see, at least in our region. Now, once that decision is made to remove a child, there is so much that happens simultaneously during that process. The investigator, it constantly continues to gather information, not only for the investigation, but really in their efforts also to start identifying alternative placements in the community for the child. They are trying to determine whether those alternative placements are viable. They have to conduct home studies, and they're gathering information also to inform specific documents, specific tasks that they have to complete, such as the comprehensive placement assessment in order to guide appropriateness of placement. There tends to be a lot of required tasks and documentation while they're at the same time trying to address one of the most delicate circumstances possibly of their career. This investigator have just told or is about to tell a parent that they're removing their child from them. A lot is also happening with the parent whose parental capacities are being questioned. They are experiencing a lot of intrusion, a sense of loss of control, really. They are experiencing guilt, fear as to what will happen next. And all of that, notwithstanding variables such as mental illness, substance abuse, or possible DV dynamics that could be at play, and that could likely escalate tensions and lead to possible arrests or Baker Acts, hospitalizations of one type or another. Those parents have just been told or are about to be told that their child will be removed from them. A lot also happens with the child in that very moment. When children are being removed, they experience so many different emotions. And those emotions can be directed at themselves or others, including their siblings who could also be removed. Children experience anger, sadness, guilt, confusion, fear. They don't even know where they're going. They don't even know where they're being taken. They don't even know why they're being taken somewhere else. All they know is that they're being taken from possibly the only familiar setting that they've ever had, no matter how dysfunctional we think it is. So as a child gets removed, we want to think also about the child doesn't just get removed from a home. They don't just change homes. They change communities, they change schools. A child loses those immediate connections with family, with friends, with their neighbors, with their teachers, with schoolmates, and their pets even. Those children may have not been told anything about what's happening. And I recognize, having done this work and talked to so many different investigators and case managers and parents and children, it is a very difficult task to break bad news to anyone or talk about something terrible that has happened. Oftentimes, as adults even, we make the choice to avoid those conversations. And we'll talk a little bit more about some strategies on how to actually do those difficult conversations, have those difficult conversations. In one-parent removals, the child may be buffered to some extent. The impact may be different for a child as they're familiar with one parent, but they still can wonder about when they will be seeing their other parent. But in most out-of-home removals, what we do see is that, in general, children are left to their own demise in making sense of their new reality, of their changing world. In 1998, a series of interviews was conducted on about 90 children, ages 8 to 14, that had been removed. And some of the children's responses reflected 4 specific themes in their feelings. In collecting the information from those interviews, what was found is that children experience a sense of being apprehended, fear and bewilderment, loss, abandonment, and helplessness. And I've included some of those quotes just to give you a sense of the language and those words and how powerful they paint the picture for us to understand what the child is actually experiencing. Here's the experience recounted, the experience of a removal recounted through the voice of an adult that was one of those children. So let's take a listen.
Being taken from place to place and being sent to a whole new different city and a whole new different family and people that you've never met before, it's a really confusing experience. You just feel torn away from your community. It's like, just imagine that you were going to work one day and it's just a normal day and you're on your way to work and everything is as it's supposed to be, and you watered your dog and you drank your coffee and you tell your kids goodbye and you go to work, and then the police show up at your job and they say, okay, we're moving you to a totally different city and you don't know anybody and you can't call your family and you can't call any of your friends and you need to leave your phone here and you can't take any of your stuff with you. We'll figure that out later. And they just pick you up and they transport you to a totally different place and then tell you to just wait in this room for a little while because we're going to figure things out. And then they come and bring you a little sack luncheon, and it's, oh, just a few more hours and we're going to figure this out. Just here, play with this little toy, okay, put this little ring on a hook. And then they send you to these really well-meaning people but you have no idea who they are, and their house smells different, and maybe they have a dog, and they have hardwood floors, you've only ever had carpet. Like, everything about the experience is alien to you. And all you want is to be able to contact the people that you have a bond with. It's a very disrupting experience. And in a lot of ways, it's a traumatic experience because all of these things are unexpected, and suddenly everything in your world that you felt was safe and secure and concrete is not. And having those ideas shattered is really difficult, especially as a child, because you need that security. You need to know that here's my bed, I can come home to it, and this is where it's gonna be, and that's gonna be okay. Or here's my mom, and no matter what, she's gonna be there for me, and I can just call her and she'll show up, and that's gonna be okay. When you can't believe that anymore, it starts to make you question, well, what can you believe? Who can you trust? What is a for sure thing? You begin to stop valuing certain things. You stop valuing relationships because they're not concrete and they're not going to be there forever. And you stop investing yourself in certain things. And all of a sudden, stability isn't really important to you. Having goals isn't important to you. You are concerned with, where are you going to sleep tonight? Are you going to be safe? Who are these people? Doing a simple thing like taking a shower in a stranger's home is a very disconcerting experience. So the more that you get moved around, the more trauma that you endure in that. Every single move is a traumatic experience. So you can see the consequences later on. And really you can see the consequences pretty early on. As a child who's in foster care, I exhibited signs of not being able to trust other people, of not wanting to connect. I had some really antisocial behavior. I also had a deep dislike for government agencies, for the police, for social workers. Like, I did not believe that they were on my team, because when I'm telling you that this is what I need and you're just not listening and you're saying, well, this is what we feel you need, I can't trust you any longer. As a child, you do not have the capacity to forward think. You are not able to, and scientifically your brain isn't even wired to do that yet. And so the decisions that you're making are pure emotional. When you're dealing with a traumatic situation and when the people around you don't have the tools to help you deal with that, the decisions that you're making are pure instinctive. And so I just know that if I have this incredible amount of sadness and this incredible amount of fear and I don't know what to do with it, well, maybe I should just run away. Maybe I should do drugs. Maybe I should get in fights. Maybe I should cuss out my foster parents. There's all kinds of different things that happen. None of those things were planned. All of those things were unintended consequences because I didn't know how to deal with the original emotions that I was facing. And so I really just want people to understand that these kids just need help.
As we just heard in the video, there are so many emotions a child experiences during and after a removal. And the adults around them in that moment may not even have the tools or ability to talk to the children about what is happening. Children are left to navigate various trauma responses with very limited to no support sometimes during the removal. And those trauma responses can be either immediate or delayed. So what kind of trauma responses are we talking about specifically? We're going to talk about a few, about the emotional types of responses, physical responses, cognitive responses, and behavioral responses that a child may exhibit and that we need to watch out for. So first, we're going to look at the emotional responses. Emotionally, what happens with a child immediately or after? Children can experience some immediate reactions such as sadness. They may be tearful and demonstrate the sadness. That sadness could be demonstrated through anger. And confusion is also a common experience or emotion that children have. You can also see numbing, where they seem detached from their thoughts, their behaviors, and the moment itself. As a helping adult, what can we do to attend to a child during that time at a removal? First of all, it's important to understand that extreme reactions for children could be related to something completely biological. There's a lot going on in the brain, which we'll address in a little bit. Neurons are firing very rapidly, and it's affecting a child's perception and their ability to actually regulate emotions or be emotionally stable. It may be just impossible for the child in that time to emotionally regulate themselves. So we want to be mindful of that. We want to be mindful of what we're expecting a child. And when we say things, for instance, such as, calm down, which is a pet peeve of mine, and not the words that really are going to make a difference. Later in therapy, children obviously will need to work through specific strategies with clinicians to be taught coping skills, to be taught how to tolerate distress, and through different activities such as mindfulness practices and cognitive reframing activities, and so on and so forth. Children may also present with physical symptoms, and some of those symptoms can include sleep disturbance, gastrointestinal problems, even skin disorders. We want to rule out any type of medical condition that may actually require medical attention, and other ways to help, in addition to seeking medical attention when needed, is to implement good sleep hygiene practices, good nutrition, incorporate exercise, and so on and so forth. There are also specific biological changes that are happening as well in the brain itself as a result of trauma or highly stressful situations. And numerous studies have revealed that severe and prolonged trauma can actually have an impact on brain development in a child. There have been documented changes in transformation in the limbic system functioning itself. In particular, the corpus callosum, which is that little white matter structure that helps the left and the right brain communicate. We have our left brain that is focusing on language and logic, trying to make sense of right and wrong, trying to understand cause and effect. And we have our right brain that is nonverbal, that is helping the child self-soothe or the person self-soothe. And if those two brains are not communicating, you don't have healthy brain functioning. So when there are changes to that corpus callosum that is responsible for that communication happening, a person may not be able to make sense of the trauma and recover. So keep that in mind as well. There are, again, biological changes that could be beyond what you can do in the moment and later on can be addressed through therapy to help the child and the person recover and regain more control over their experience of the trauma. Additionally, and as I mentioned before, when individuals experience trauma, brain activity rises to an extreme level. There are a lot of chemicals being released, neurotransmitters, stress hormones, and for children that have very consistent high levels of stress or extreme trauma, you can actually see a decrease in the development of brain structures that deal with learning and memory. And that's why a lot of times you'll see children present with learning disabilities having had trauma. So one way to help is to provide emotional safety first and foremost. And that emotional safety includes that communication to children as developmentally appropriate as possible, explaining to children what's happening and what will happen next. Also providing comfort through sensory experiences. And it could be something as simple as asking the child if there's a particular item from home that they want to take with them, a toy, a blanket, or their soap, to reduce the traumatic response and foster that emotional safety. Traumatic experiences also affect and alter cognitions. From the outset, trauma challenges our just world, our core assumptions that help us navigate life. For instance, if you get into your car and you're driving and you get hit from behind, your perception of safety is challenged and can lead you to have compensating behaviors. So all of a sudden you're constantly looking and checking your rearview mirror until that belief is restored or reworked. Some individuals, however, may never return to their previous belief system and find a way to rework those traumas and those tragedies that have happened. And it can result in a worldview that is unsafe. If you believe your world is unsafe, you also may have difficulty trusting others. So again, there are a lot of repercussions here on a cognitive level of what trauma can do. And those ramifications can be long lasting. People can end up developing what we call cognitive errors, thinking some situations are dangerous when they're not. You can actually see a lot in children that experience of inappropriate guilt or excessive guilt. Children sometimes can assume responsibility for the event that happened, especially when others next to them may have not survived the trauma and they're the survivors of the trauma. Oftentimes also with children, you can see idealization. And this is something that occurs specifically when the perpetrator, the person inflicting the trauma, is a caregiver. A child can start justifying the perpetrator's behaviors. They can experience what's called traumatic bonding, and they may have exhibited compassion towards the perpetrator, a sense of loyalty for the perpetrator even. With trauma, we also see people respond to specific triggers that set off the memory of the trauma. Sometimes you can see children act in ways that confuse adults. They might become aggressive for no apparent reason, and they might show hyperactivity, or they might be unable to pay attention to others or processes. And they might be very clingy or seem clingy to adults that they view as safe. So there are other cognitive aspects to the cognitive responses, specifically related to flashbacks, where children or anybody really experiencing trauma may literally re-experience a traumatic event as if it's happening again at that moment. So these are situations that happen with very severe trauma, and it can be very distressing, as you can imagine, for the person experiencing those. Sometimes it can be so distressing, you have extreme cases where children or folks in general experiencing trauma can have a breakdown with the connections with their thoughts, with memories, with actions, and they completely lose their sense of identity and they start dissociating. Now, I know that the word dissociation could be very tricky to wrap our heads around, but in reality, if you think about it, we all experience dissociation at one level or another. When we drive to work and we don't remember the last few minutes of the drive, it's a type of dissociation. In this case, in a case where you don't remember the last minutes of your drive, it happens because we engage in automatic processes and we're not immediately paying attention to our environment. But dissociation, in the sense of the trauma in that context, can happen because of severe trauma, severe stress, and it serves as a protective element. That dissociation helps distance the experience from the individual. And it's a type of trauma response that's actually closely associated, like I said, with histories of severe childhood trauma, and most of the times trauma that are human caused, that are intentional trauma, such as sexual abuse. Some of the responses associated with dissociation can also include depersonalization, when you feel as if you're leaving your body, you're watching yourself from a distance as an observer. There can also be derealization, where you have a sense of what's taking place is unfamiliar, it's actually not real, it's not happening. One way to help specifically in therapy is with grounding techniques, helping the child distinguish from what is happening now and what has happened in the past. Also normalizing the child's reaction as common traumatic stress reactions, normalizing those reactions for the child. Finally, children exhibit behavioral symptoms as a result of trauma. Children actually tell us a whole lot about what they've lived through their behaviors. You can see children engage, especially young ones, in reenactments where their play mimics what happened during the trauma. Some can also engage in avoidance behaviors, and they begin to avoid people, places, or certain things because they're related to those unpleasant memories and circumstances. Initially, the avoidance may work, but over time, anxiety actually increases, and that perception of the situation, they perceive it as unbearable or dangerous, it actually increases as well. So it's very maladaptive. So while avoidance can be adaptive in the moment, it's also a behavioral pattern that reinforces a perceived danger without the person having the ability to test the validity of that danger. Other children, especially older ones, can start engaging in substance use as a behavioral symptom, or self-injurious behaviors, cutting, that we see a lot, especially with children surviving sexual abuse. It's a way for them to cope with their emotions and regain that sense of control. So again, the help here is trying to teach children coping skills, teach them how to manage triggers, memories, their emotions without avoidance. And this in therapy occurs through a lot of specific techniques, such as desensitization techniques. And also the other part, very important part, especially when you have self-injurious behaviors, is creating personal safety plans with the child. So we've talked a lot about different trauma responses, really taking a look at the many ways trauma can impact the child. But where do we go from here? First, we must recognize the hard truth. And the truth is that, unfortunately, our protection of children, our wanting to keep children safe, may traumatize children. The truth is that a removal is a traumatic event. We are traumatizing or possibly re-traumatizing children in some of our practices. And those adverse situations can even occur in treatment settings. It's not uncommon for that to happen, even in the most well-intentioned settings. We can inadvertently create those traumatizing or re-traumatizing experiences. And there are many ways that can happen, such as when a child's response is minimized or ignored. When a child receives an evaluation with CPT, for instance, the child protection team, and they have to undress or be medically examined. Or when we fail to provide basic security and safety for a child. So re-traumatization occurs when people actually experience something that makes them feel unsafe and as though they are undergoing another trauma. And the system's harm does include that trauma of the removal, the separation from those attachment figures and traumatic transitions, lack of continuity amongst individuals who are designated to help, to care, and even additional maltreatment that can occur in foster care. So what role do we play in it all? Let's pause and reflect on this for a minute and think about the many ways we contribute to re-traumatization. What role do we play in re-traumatization? How can we minimize or eliminate re-traumatization in the work that we do? And how can we increase awareness of our own impact on the removal? There is clearly a need for early and immediate intervention during the removal process, and one that provides security and safety first and foremost. Children need a safe and child-friendly environment instead of being in cold, sterile offices while awaiting placement or driving around in a car with an investigator. They need an environment that provides adequate support to be able to explain to them what's happening, where they're going, and guide them in identifying initial coping skills. With that in mind, in Miami, we implemented such a place that we call the Children's Reception and Intake Base. It's a welcoming, safe, and child-friendly environment that's designed to make children's immediate needs, to meet those children's immediate needs and help mitigate the trauma of the removal itself. It's a space where the child can be taken to immediately after removal if a therapist is unable to be present at the site of the removal. Those processes happen very fast, and sometimes we may not be able to arrive at the scene of the removal in time. We make every effort to actually be there because this is the moment of intervention, and as early as needed is where we want to try to intervene. But when not possible, we do have a space where children can actually have those processes talked to them about, and they can actually have the support that they need during that difficult time. It's a space where children can shower, eat, engage in play activities, watch television, sleep, and prepare together with staff a bag with clothes, toys, toiletries to make their transition as less painful as possible. The following pictures will give you a sample of our facilities in Miami, and it gives you an example also of what can be done with very, very little space. So in the next slide, you'll see we have 2 rooms actually in that particular crib facility, and one that accommodates for older children, and another one that accommodates for the smaller ones, babies and toddlers. And we have an adjoining bathroom, so they can shower, so they can tend to those other basic needs. And the staff. The crib services operate as a team approach. We have 2 types of staff with specific functions. We have a transitional trauma therapist, a master's level clinician, which we call a TTT. The TTT's role is to provide those therapeutic interventions. And we have a behavioral health technician, a BHT, that monitors the child and tends to their basic needs. So the TTT's role is to provide clinical support to the child, to the parent, to the investigator. The intervention can start at the site of the removal when possible, but oftentimes it occurs for the child at the crib. The TTT is also a resource to the CPI to engage in conversations related to the processes and the various aspects of the removal itself. There are specific conversations that occur outside of the removal that revolve around the escalation techniques, strategies in breaking the news of the removal. And the TTT also is able to provide critical incident debriefing to the investigator and other people affected, particularly in instances where we have specific tragedies such as murder-suicides, murders, or the likes. So the TTT focuses on immediate engagement, making preliminary recommendations based on brief assessments of the child. They focus on making contact as well with the biological parent after the child has come into care. They want to provide updates to the parent. That's a very critical part of the engagement process that starts a case. We want to be able to tell the parent how the child is doing, if the child has slept, has eaten. We also use that time to gather information from the parent about what can make the child more comfortable. So examples of feedback have been with parents informing us of specific nursery rhymes that the child would find soothing. So we would be able to integrate that with the child at the crib and pass that information along to their placement to help make that transition easier for the child. If the child is placed in licensed care, the TTT also participates in transition calls. We call those specific calls placement planning calls, because the placement department that identifies licensed care for the child is involved, the foster parent is involved, the case manager is involved in the call, to really share information regarding the child and make everybody aware of certain particularities, and again, provide as much as possible to make that transition as smooth as possible. If the child is placed with relatives or in kinship care, there is telephonic therapeutic support that the TTT provides to the caregiver, to the new caregiver, to assess their immediate needs and to provide that support, and again, help stabilize that placement as much as possible. In some instances, other interventions are implemented, such as overlay services. When a child is awaiting assignment of a therapist, when they're placed in care, we really don't want the child to be without an adult to talk to. So if there is a delay and we are aware of the delay, we make sure we continue to visit with the child in their new setting. And oftentimes in the early days or weeks after the removal, the TTT remains on the case to provide that support and those needed interventions. The idea is to continue to surround the child and provide that sense of support during that transition. There are also specific situations, special condition situation, where we may intervene and help a PI that's struggling with communicating with maybe some family members about very difficult news. Could be a death of one parent, and the TTT is available to actually dispatch and provide that assistance to help break the news. That might not be related to a removal per se, but again, to provide that support to the workforce. We're essentially a clinical team that is embedded with our investigators to support the child welfare processes from the child and beyond. This is a sample of our brochure on the conversations that we have with our CPIs, our investigators, on processes related to removals. Those conversations, as I mentioned before, occur in the DCF offices outside of the removals, and is really an effort to prepare investigators for those difficult situations and provide them with the opportunity to process the demands that are placed on them. We believe that those conversations not only provide direct support to our DCF partners, but they can also slowly integrate more trauma-informed practices and strategies in the investigative practice. Now, as for the second part of the CRIB team, I mentioned we utilize a CRIB approach. We felt it was important to address the specific role of meeting the child's basic needs for food, clothing, and nurturing through a BHT, a behavioral health technician. So the behavioral health technician fills that role and is able to provide comfort, nurturing for the child. They engage with them in play. They ensure that the child leaves the crib with enough supplies in a duffel bag for at least a week. No more trash bags, but really new stuff, right? And the child participates in that process of picking their items. They're empowered to, identify what it is that they want, what is it that they need, from toiletries to toys to clothes. So we're currently analyzing the impact of those interventions during the removal and have started gathering data that focus on 3 specific points. Conversations, what type of conversations are happening with the child, and if those conversations are about the reasons for the removal. Conversations to the child about placement, and conversations regarding coping skills and supports needed for the child during that transition. Our goal is to really examine the short and the long-term effects of this support on children, their time, the impact on their time and care, the possible impact on placement disruption and reunification. That's it. So let's take a look again at our first family as she recounts the ongoing struggles her and her children have endured since the removal from their home.
Sound it out.
At
Good girl.
the
Mm-hmm.
queen.
A mother feels those precious seconds slip away faster than most.
Yellow.
For Monica, the weekly visit she has with Mawani and Kaliha fly by, no matter how hard she tries to slow them down.
I know you know that word.
At by.
At her.
At her.
Mawani and Kaliha are now allowed to come home for the entire weekend, 48 hours each week for the family to rebuild their ties.
You guys are all so close to your mom, huh?
Yeah.
Has it been hard to be away from her? And to be away from home?
Yeah.
What about you, Troy? Was it hard for you to be away from her?
Yeah, it was around 5 months that I was away. And then I don't know what happened exactly, but the last court date, I got to go home, and then Kaliha and Tibby didn't. It was just bad. I just wish it was the other way around.
Why did you feel that way?
Because Kaliha and Tibby need her more than I do.
You felt like you could handle it better if you were in foster care and the girls could go home?
I don't want to talk about it no more.
Okay. You don't have to talk about it anymore. You're gonna be back with your mom soon, honey. And she's been fighting really hard for you because she wants you guys back with her. You know that, right?
Mm-hmm.
Are you proud of her?
I don't know yet.
You don't know yet?
After almost a year of uncertainty, Kaliha is afraid to trust that her and her sister's time within the foster care system may soon be over.
You want to help mommy get your stuff ready?
Yeah.
Shh, calm down.
In 1 month, Monica and her girls will be back in the courtroom.
Thank you.
A judge will decide if she can finally take her daughters home for good. Until then, each weekend must end with a separation.
All right, come on. It's hard. Every week I have to take them back. My heart is broken. Come here, give me my hug. Come here. There's not a day that doesn't go by that I don't think about that day and what I could have done different. All right.
I will talk to you this evening.
Yeah. And what this situation has done to my children.
All right, love you guys.
And that I'm the reason, I'm the cause of it. I think about it every day.
The effects of the trauma of the removal are ongoing, and the actions we take from the beginning and throughout the case really are crucial in helping the family reach the best possible outcome. So what are some strategies that we can immediately apply in attending to the trauma of a removal? We're going to talk about 3 specific key strategies that hopefully will enhance the way that you do your work so that you can more intentionally attend to the trauma and the re-traumatization of children during removals. Those 3 key strategies are awareness, attention, and response. Our first strategy of awareness involves developing a better understanding of trauma and the various responses, like we talked about, the emotional, the physical, the cognitive, and behavioral manifestations of trauma. The responses are very diverse and they vary from one child to another. We also want awareness of the biases that we bring to the table when we consider parental capacities and safety. And in something as basic as distinguishing between poverty and neglect, for instance, sometimes we can be blinded by our own filters and preconceived views, and staying aware of those biases is key in the way that we process a removal, in the way that a removal actually unfolds. Finally, we want to be aware of the power of our words and actions, or lack thereof, on the child, on the family. Because what we say and what we do in that moment has gigantic repercussions, such as telling a child that they'll be back next week to their home, when we can't actually make promises like this. A second key strategy lies with attention, which involves attending to the person's experience itself, being attuned to what they're saying, what they're doing. Try not to rush the process. Allow the person to talk and express their feelings. You also want to listen to the triggers specifically, paying attention to what may be sensitive to them, such as what we saw in the video, a parent's prior history in being in foster care. You may want to pay attention to how the badge around your neck may be a trigger. And finally, in attention, you want to empathize with the current struggle that the child, that the parent is going through. Making a person feel heard and seen is possibly one of the most important elements of engagement itself. And all of this ties naturally into our third strategy of response. Once you cultivate awareness and those attending skills, how you respond is crucial in the many possible turns a removal can take. You want to respond intentionally and purposefully. You also want a response that's focused on consistency, which is fundamental in establishing trust. You want to validate the person's experience by reflecting their emotions, acknowledging their feelings and the difficulty of what they're going through. And you want to start thinking about coping strategies to assist. Again, it can be something as little as asking a child if they like music, if they like to write, or asking them about their likes and their preferences, or asking a mom about her support system, if there's someone that she can reach out to and call for emotional support in the aftermath of the removal. Those strategies of developing awareness, attending, and responding are applicable in almost every situation, but particularly helpful for us to practice in times of conflict and distress. And those strategies also work hand in hand with efforts that should be ongoing in order to promote connections for children in the community. We want to remember that familiarity is more important than safety in a child's mind. You want to assist relatives and non-relatives that become new caregivers as much as possible. You want to keep family finding efforts ongoing, and as those efforts should really never stop throughout the child's stay in care, so we can foster as many family connections as possible. This is an integral part of the continuity of care. And that continuity of care also includes coordination of services, services for the child, services for the parent, so no gap is experienced. A child should never, never be alone without someone to talk to. A child should also be given the model of watching their biological parent and their new caregiver collaborate together for their care. Children feel more secure when they see adults in their life work together and collaborate together. Integrating quality parenting initiative principles are an important part of that process to promote better parenting and lasting relationships for children. We're going to watch one last video to encourage you all to think about the changes that you can make in your own practice, and really to focus on how to mitigate this traumatic experience of a removal.
There's no words to express the feeling of when you're looking out the back window at your mom, and you know that you're leaving her.
I think if I would have felt wanted by any of the homes or by anybody in general, I think I would have been a lot less angry.
I just felt like I did not belong there at all, because I knew that in my heart that I had a real family and that this is not where I'm supposed to be, but I felt like I had no way to express that and no one to express it to.
A lot of these people are just using government money to get by, and that's how I look at it. I mean, I've been in quite a few homes where it was better off if I would have stayed at my mom's house.
When I turned 18, I put everything I had in like a garbage bag and I walked out the door. Had I had a proper like structure in place to age out with, I think I could have made it.
Altogether, I was moved 27 times throughout some of the same placements multiple times.
Probably about 24 or more. I was in and out of mental hospitals, PRTFs, foster homes, group homes, and then I was on the run.
At the time, I thought my mom didn't want us, or, you know, that's what I was led to believe, that my mom wasn't able to take care of us.
She did her best by me as she could. She didn't ever abuse me. She didn't ever neglect me. And if there was neglect, it was never intentional.
I was having a lot of behavioral issues. My mom called and got help for me. She didn't know what to do.
I was just too much for my mom with everything that was going on. Yeah, I was really rebellious. I mean, cutting, having sex, doing meth, running. I didn't make it easy.
The first foster home I was in, that's the first time I had been abused. The foster lady, I wrote in the book where she came in the room and she started assaulting me. She like pushing my head. I had a carpet burn on my face.
A lot of the times where I would go to talk to people about the problems that I was experiencing in foster care, it didn't help. You know, they would take the information and tell the foster parents, who would in turn deal with me even more harshly.
I think not being able to safely speak about my fears and my worries and my concerns, I think that made me very secretive at a very young age, because I feel like I didn't have any safety and my concerns only angered others.
Very few did I ever walk in and feel like I can call this home. I can go to the kitchen and get a sandwich if I need it.
I felt like I was abandoned by my mother, my father, my family. And so growing up in the foster home where this lady didn't like nurture me in that way, I started like hating myself. And so I had like suicidal thoughts. When you have those type of feelings for yourself, I can't show love to someone else.
My freshman year, I did 9 schools.
Took about a month each time for anybody to even enroll me in school.
And when you get put in foster care, you can't concentrate on school. Like, that's the farthest thing that you're really worried about.
I mean, I don't really like to blame my problems on the system, because, I mean, we're responsible for what happens with us. I feel like the system could have at least prepared me to be 18 and by myself way better than they did.
Do I blame foster care for where I am? I would say partially they're responsible. I think had I been put with the right home, I don't think I would have ended up in this place.
The state absolutely dropped the ball with me. They didn't teach me life skills. They didn't teach me socialization. They didn't teach me stability.
It steals their childhood. It steals their joy. It steals anything, momentum that or potential that we could have. You grow up so fast. You grow up with this trauma, and it makes you bitter. It makes you angry.
We need to look at this. This is a society issue. This isn't a family issue. This is a society issue at large.
I think that children who are going through a traumatic experience, they need at least one deep emotional attachment with an adult who gives them the message that they are loved, valued, and accepted unequivocally.
I firmly believe that before we can do criminal justice reform, we need to do foster care reform.
Separation from a parent or from parents is traumatic, but it is not the separation itself that predicts pathological outcome. Rather, it's the way it's handled by the adults in the child's life. the responses that children receive in their immediate environment during and right after the trauma can either complicate and affect those trauma responses that they're going to have, or it could help, it could assist. The trauma response itself is actually less important than the degree to which there are efforts in place to help the child regulate their emotions, sustain self-esteem, and maintain those interpersonal relationships and contacts with the ones that they love. So as our time comes to an end this morning, I want to first thank all of you for joining today. And I hope that this webinar has added to your toolbox of strategies for when you're involved in a removal, or if you're working with someone that's involved in a removal. Think about one thing that you can take away from today to apply in your work, in your practice, as you engage with children and families, as you engage specifically with children undergoing a removal. Thank you so much for your time, and I think we can have some questions now.